So let's move through our readings for this week chronologically in terms of, like I said, the waves in which each reading is situated. And hopefully beyond that outline on the first slide, you can get a better idea of what each wave consists of in terms of the theorists and ideas that occupied each wave. So we're starting with the earliest writer of the three, Simone de Beauvoir. She was a French existentialist philosopher, and existentialist philosophy pertains to the nature of human existence, and it can lead to a lot of deep and potentially scary questions about the purpose of life, the meaning of life, or perhaps the lack thereof. She got her PhD in philosophy from the prestigious École Normale Supérieure in Paris in 1923, and at that time, she was only the ninth woman in all of France to attain a philosophy degree. Not just a PhD, a degree in general. Imagine being the ninth person in your entire country to get an undergrad degree in a certain field, which just goes to show how much of a trailblazer de Beauvoir was and how she paved the way within this uncharted territory of academic philosophy for a lot of women to follow, especially in continental philosophy, which is to say the European style of philosophy. De Beauvoir was also a fiction writer who wrote several novels that are combinations of fiction and her own autobiographical experiences. And she also did a lot of non-fictional writing, like her own memoirs, which include details and descriptions related to her famous relationship with another French philosopher, Jean-Paul Sartre. He was also an existentialist, so I imagine their conversations would have been scintillating and depressing at the same time. And it was this decades-long open relationship between the two that involved many other third parties and liaisons and dalliances due to de Beauvoir being bisexual and involving third women in that relationship over the years. And as I alluded to, it was one of the most widely discussed relationships in France at the time and in philosophy in general, because it was so rare for two such high profile figures in philosophy to not only be together, but to have a somewhat turbulent relationship. Because as you can imagine, there was a lot of drama involved in bringing in third women, which again she alluded to in a lot of her nonfiction and fictional writings. By virtue of being embroiled in this famous relationship, de Beauvoir was often reduced to just an intellectual who was the lover of a famous male philosopher, which is such a classic move to discredit all of the highly influential work she conducted as an independent scholar and activist and philosopher, in which she was truly revolutionary in her own right, but as is often the case, by virtue of being a woman, her claim to fame was being Sartre's girlfriend, which is an unfair representation of her life and work and what it inspired in terms of the second and third waves of feminism. And arguably the most influential piece of work from that body of work is her 1949 treatise on the second sex, which the introduction to which is the reading for this week. And in it, she provides a very detailed and elucidative statement on women's oppression, which proved to make foundational inroads into contemporary feminism. So this reading, de Beauvoir's Introduction to the Second Sex, is full of interesting ideas that, although the writing is quite dated, it was written like 70 years ago at this point, the ideas themselves still bear a lot of relevance to the experience of women and other marginalized people in today's society. So according to de Beauvoir, the masculine gendered subject position is typically treated as the default and the universal within discourses. So for example, terms such as chairman and policeman and fireman and freshman and mankind and man-made all denote the male by default, as if humanity in general is conflated with men, leaving women with only specialized roles predefined for them by men. As a society, we've tried to get past this to some degree by redefining these terms, like instead of chairman, chairperson, or instead of fireman, firefighter, or instead of policeman, police officer. But there's still that indelible mark of masculinity and the male in the terms and the language we use. Like think of just about any term and think about which gender is associated with it by default, and how if the other gender tries to occupy that subject position, they usually need to make alterations or modifications to it. So a female chairperson, they may need to often emphasize the fact that they are a female chairperson, because just the word chairperson conjures up the idea of a male a lot of the time, as if there's like this extra step that women need to take to possess meaning in a lot of the desirable positions in society. And then contrastingly, think of some derogatory terms, like the word whore, for example. What gender is evoked when you hear that word? It's a very negative term, and unfortunately, it's just like in that case, the default is women. So why is that the case? That all these positive terms are associated with men by default, and then the only terms that are associated with women are negative terms. So that if a man is described as a whore, they usually need to add that addendum of a man whore. And even then, it takes on more positive connotations, like it's something to be celebrated and taken humorously, like, oh, he's such a man whore. As if, it's saying like he's such a player or he's such a womanizer. Whereas those meanings aren't associated with the original term whore. It's like purely negative connotations that are associated with that word and with the women who are put into that subject position by the gender terminology used to describe them. So within language itself, the feminine gender is or tends to always be relegated to an alternative to the default, or a deviation from the imposed norm or standard within each discourse. So that most discourses favor and cater to male subject positions much more readily than female subject positions, so that it's easy and effortless for a man to occupy the position of a chairman or chairperson, because it's been structured for them to occupy it and structured to preclude women from occupying a position of power and the word that denotes it. Thus, according to de Beauvoir, humanity is male, or is discursively constructed as male, and man defines women, not in herself, but as relative to him. So women are always being defined in relation to men. She is not regarded as an autonomous being. Man can think of himself and define himself without woman, but she cannot think of herself or define herself without man. And she is simply what man decrees her to be. She is defined and differentiated with reference to man, and not he with reference to her. So it's a one-way street. Man defines woman, but woman doesn't reciprocally define man or herself. She is the incidental, the inessential, as opposed to the essential. He is the subject. He is the absolute. She is an object. She is the other. And keep that word in mind. Other, capital O. It'll play a very important role not only in this lecture, but the culture lecture and throughout the rest of the course. So man is the subject in discourse. Woman is the object of discourse. Man defines his own meaning, but woman's meaning is defined for them by man. Women are defined in relation to men. Women are never defined in themselves, autonomously, and separate from considerations of man. So that to enter any discourse is to enter a discourse that's constructed by male figures in ways that confer benefits on the male subject positions in that discourse. So again, the chairman example. So that often when females become chair people, in order for them to possess meaning in that position of power, they need to adopt mannerisms inherent to males. So they may cut their hair very short and wear those kind of like power suits, anything that kind of robs them and that sheds them of their feminine characteristics in order to act like a man. Because a very feminine figure isn't conferred meaning within that subject position of a chairperson in discourse. So men can shape the identities and the destinies of women, but women can't reciprocally wield the power of discourse to define men in the same way. Man is the universal. Like I said, most words and most terms just universally denote men by default, as if they're the only true sex, the one, capital O, and then women are the second sex. Like I read a lot of philosophy from throughout the ages, and you think philosophers are these enlightened individuals who would be aware of the genderization of the terms that they're using in their philosophical treatises. But in basically any of those writings, whenever those philosophers are using like a hypothetical example of a person, they always unequivocally say he. They refer to that hypothetical person as a he. You almost never hear them write he or she or they. He is just the default, as if the only possible social agents who are capable of operating meaningfully in society and making change and making history have to be male. And again, these philosophers are supposed to be the wisest people in a society. So if they're thinking in these very gendered, masculine-oriented ways, then how do you think that reflects upon the general societies that existed at those times? So men are the one, capital O, one, and women are always defined in relation to men as the other, capital O, other. Hence, women are who the title of de Beauvoir's book, The Second Sex, is referring to, as they're always second place, second in consideration. Like I said, in order for a woman to fit meaningfully into a position such as chairperson, they need to make alterations and modifications to that word to give them space to occupy it. And again, even when they do so, they often need to adopt male characteristics and traits and behaviors. As if men, like I said, are truly the only social agents and the makers of history and the bearers of destiny, and men are the only ones who can do great things, and women are just the second sex. They're reduced to a sex. They're just a sexual being for men to enjoy when they're not off busy making history. Women are seen as the supporters and the upholders of male dominance. Another quote from de Beauvoir is that she says, "A man would never set out to write a book on the peculiar situation of the human male." Like there's a reason why there's a dire need for feminism and feminist writings, whereas you don't see all these books from a masculinism perspective. Like there's no books on the struggles of man and how hard it is to be a man and how all the obstacles that are in your way when you're a male. Again, men are oriented and positioned within discourse, so they don't have to worry about that. So they can get to the brass tacks and just make history and focus on important things. Whereas women, before they can even get to focusing on other things, they need to defend themselves and grapple with their own existence and the nature of being a female and the struggles and the experiences inherent to that, thus creating this body of feminist writings. So that for men, like the first step to going out in society and making change and being a social agent is as simple as that. It's the step number one. But for women, there are many, many steps they need to do and to take in order to even get to that point. So let me continue that quote. "A man would never set out to write a book on the peculiar situation of the human male, but if I, de Beauvoir, wish to define myself, I must first of all say I am a woman, and on this truth must be based all further discussion." A man never begins by presenting himself as an individual of a certain sex. It goes without saying that he is a man. Like women they need to like preface everything they say with like as a woman, therefore so and so. But you never hear a man say, well, as a man, it's just non-problematic for them. Just be a man as the default subject position in discourse. And women, contrastingly, are marked by their sexuality, by their gender, and everything they do and say. That's why throughout history, there are cases of female writers or other historical figures pretending to be men so that their writings and their actions aren't immediately discredited. And they don't have to go through all of those steps of justifying their existence as a woman. They can just bypass that and begin initiating change, social change, as men do and are empowered to do. So finishing that quote, man represents both the positive and the neutral, as is indicated by the common use of man to designate human beings in general, like I said with the example of all those philosophers. Whereas women represent only the negative, defined by limiting criteria without reciprocity. So women are the shadow of man. They are the flip side of the coin that is man and it's made by men. And they're always defined by men in relation to men as having limiting criteria. So a woman is a woman because they aren't a man in this way or that way. They're always defined as lacking things that men possess without reciprocation, without reciprocity. So men define themselves and they define women. Women don't define men and they don't even define themselves in discourse.